All right, Derek, we hit the offense yesterday. It is time for the defensive free agency preview. We do the same stuff we did yesterday. Big ticket guys, our favorite fits, a couple landmines that we're worried about, some trades that we think might be realistic. I liked yesterday's vibe, so we're going to try to do the same thing again here today.
Yeah, I'm excited for it. These have been good. I mean, free agency is always a weird period because inevitably when we do our live stream on Monday, something insane is going to happen. But when you're trying to project it, you can only go so far on the insanity. So it's trying to toe the line between what is a reasonable expectation versus knowing something's going to rock our world on Monday.
This is all about getting one prediction right and being happy about it the whole time.
Being able to trot that out for a week.
Last year for me, it was Andrew Van Ginkel going to the Vikings. It was like, that was the one thing where I was just like, I think that makes sense. Skill set wise, like where they're at right now, Andrew Van Ginkel makes a ton of sense for Minnesota. It happened. I was done. So now that's all I need. I just need one of these from the two shows that we're doing to hit, and I'll feel good for the next 72 hours.
And not only did you get the signing right, he was awesome for them. Like it was a double whammy. You got it right from both angles.
Few news items just to run through really quickly. Some of these came out like right before we started recording yesterday, but they were defense specific, so I felt it was just easier to hit them today. Zack Baun back to Philadelphia on a 3-year, $51 million extension with $34 million guaranteed. Just another example of it's that the South Park meme. It's just like, and it's gone. That's how I feel about all the top free agents every year. Just like as soon as it's about to start, it's like, and they're gone. Zack Baun played phenomenal this year. Obviously, the Eagles were going to have a hole at linebacker if they let him go. Instead, they bring him back on what is kind of an interesting contract when you look at the tiering of it. We can talk about that in a second, but your initial reactions to the Zack Baun return to Philadelphia.
I think it's perfect because he's, I want to say 4th or 5th now in average annual salary among linebackers, which is like, that's perfectly fine for a guy a way that he just played. Like he's not quite tippy top of the market with the all-pro guys. And part of that is just because we've only seen it for 1 year from him. But I think he was awesome. And what's I think interesting about Philly is over the past 10, 12 years or so, their investment level at linebacker is typically low in terms of like trying to find the right guy. But when they do find a right guy, they'll try to keep him around. And I think that this is an example of that. So I like it for them. I like it for Baun sticking around in a system that you know works for you. And like Vic Fangio's probably not going to go anywhere and take another job. So you know the system works. Like it's just perfect marriage for everybody here.
I think when people talk about the Eagles and you look at, they'll pay certain positions, they won't pay other positions. I don't think the lines are that hard and fast. I think it's about where can we get this production elsewhere if we don't pay this guy. With Saquon, the answer was nowhere. Like there's nothing that we can do to our offense that's going to be more valuable than the $13 million a year we pay Saquon Barkley. Some of that is the dip in the running back market, but they came to that conclusion when so many people thought, oh, they'll never pay a running back. Same thing is true here. Like, how are you going to replicate what Zack Baun gave you as a first-team All-Pro in this defense? You can probably get some version of it for cheaper, but you're not going to be able to get this sort of production elsewhere. So it's just about scarcity of skill sets and scarcity of impact. And so I can understand looking at the entire board if you're Howie Roseman and saying, what are we going to do? We're going to bring in Jerome Baker for $5 million a year and decide to roll with that. Why would we do that when we can just bring this guy back and bring back some certainty for what he brings to this version of the defense?
The point of the Eagles taking bets like Zack Baun or even like Jordan Mailata in the draft isn't that you get them for cheap the one or handful of years on the rookie contract. It's that like, wow, we stumbled into this incredible player that we now can go pay, and we did it for basically nothing. And that's obviously what they're doing here. Like you said, the Eagles will pay very good players. Like sometimes in terms of where they're willing to spend initially on new free agents, or they probably won't spend a first round pick on a linebacker. But again, it's one of those things like Howie doesn't typically let very good players out of the building very easily.
The only thing I will say is that a couple years ago they did this with James Bradberry, where they traded for James Bradberry. He was making like $7 million against the cap that year. Might not have been a trade. He ended up there. He was making $7 million against the cap that year. And they had planned always to move on from him after the season. And because of the way that defense played and because they went to the Super Bowl, they brought him back. And I think that was a mistake. I don't think this is a mistake. I don't think you look at what that secondary was in 2022, it was largely a product of the pass rush and how quickly the pass rush was getting home. Zack Baun isn't really the product of anything. Like what he was doing with that within that defense exists on its own. And so I think paying somebody like that compared to paying somebody like James Bradberry, I feel a little bit better about this one.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more.
Other big signing from yesterday, Maxx Crosby makes a shitload of money. 3 years, $106 million with the Raiders. Looking at some of the details, I think Pro Football Talk put out the actual details of the contract today. Not a lot of funny money involved in this one. Sometimes you get that number pumped up because you throw some huge salaries on the back end of it. The Raiders did it with Devontae Adams. Doesn't seem like that's what's going on here. It seems like this is just, we're making you the highest paid non-quarterback in the NFL, full stop. And performative is maybe the wrong word because it does mean something, but having this be the first thing you do as a new regime where it's like, this is our guy, this is what we want to be, let's reward him, not necessarily surprising, but a very nice day for Maxx Crosby and for the next 6 generations of his family.
Yeah, maybe performative, but like also necessary because at the end of last season, he was like, I don't know if I want to be here anymore. So we're going to make you the highest paid player. We're not going to worry about it. And I think it's well-deserved. Outside of Myles Garrett and Micah Parsons, he, to me, might be the best pass rusher in the league, the best defensive end, and he's an Iron Man. He plays every snap. Like
plays like 1,200 snaps a year.
The story last year was that he missed like one game, and it was like, Maxx Crosby finally missed some time. But like that, for the fact that that's a story that this long in his career is like incredible. So he, to me, is just no-brainer any amount of money.
Yeah, this is one of those where I think it's about finding a balance because his contract was such a bargain when they initially signed it. And I think this is what good teams do. It's the same thing the Eagles just did with Saquon Barkley, where it's like, yeah, you're probably making less than you might be worth in a vacuum. You've played well enough and you're important enough to our franchise that we're going to reward you, even if it's not necessarily in our best interest as we're counting the beans and trying to figure out where we can save money, where we should spend money, et cetera. So I think that's what this feels like, similar to the conversation we had about Saquon yesterday, and good for the Raiders and good for Maxx Crosby. I think it's worthwhile every single time. Sticking in the AFC West with pass rushers, Joey Bosa released by the Los Angeles Chargers. This is not surprising. They save a ton of money by moving on from him. He agreed to a pay cut last year. So at a certain point, this was probably always going to be the way that this ended. Now the biggest question is going to be, does this mean they bring Khalil Mack back? Not at all costs, but they're more aggressive in doing it just because now you got Thule and essentially nobody else along your defensive line, but not necessarily surprising to see the Chargers do this with Joey Bosa.
Yeah, they've flirted with this for 2 or 3 years now, just based on some of the injury stuff. He's making a ton of money. So it kind of made sense, especially now that there's a new coaching staff. Last year, I understand them wanting to just keep as many of the real deal veterans in the building, and obviously Bosa was that. Now that they've maybe established themselves a little bit more, they are willing to move on from a guy like Bosa. And then, like you mentioned, now that Bosa's out of the building, maybe have to keep Khalil Mack is a little bit strong, but I would be very strongly doing whatever I can to try to keep Khalil Mack in the building for 1 or 2 more years because he's still playing at a really, really high level. Like he is still to me like a borderline Pro Bowl level player. If they still think that they can get that for 2 more years out of him, I would be willing to pay that, especially like you said, outside of Thule, who is like a good number 3, they just don't have a whole lot of other options behind those guys.
It's always worrying when you get a guy that's this deep into his career. You want to be a year early and not a year late. But I think with the level he's playing at, how big of a need they have at that position. And also, like, Khalil Mack is a really, really good person to have in the building.
Yes.
It's just like as a culture guy and just like the way that it sets the tone for how your whole defense plays. You're still a relatively young team around him. I think you'll probably get even younger after this draft. So I do feel like there are a lot of side benefits to potentially bringing him back. We'll talk about that in a second, but I'm with you. And I don't know if this becomes necessary, but I do think it potentially increases the urgency to get Khalil Mack back at the end of this process. Let's get to some of the big ticket items on this side of the ball in free agency this year. Khalil Mack is one of those. We'll talk about him in a minute. Let's start with Jevon Holland, because I think that as a lot of these other guys have come off the board and just the offensive free agents for the most part getting franchised. But if you look at the real swings in free agency this year, these second contract players that are worth paying, at or near the top of the market. Jevon Holland is one of the only names on that list on either side of the ball. What do you think about the Jevon Holland market and how it might unfold? And are there any landing spots that are particularly intriguing to you here?
I really like Jevon Holland. I mean, I think he's been a really good player for the Dolphins for a while now. Obviously, he has some injury stuff that I think is going to complicate some of his process. I think the other thing that actually hurts Jevon Holland a little bit, it's a pretty good safety free agent class. Like
it really is.
Like there's
there's
not a lot
there's a lot of inventory at the very least.
Yes, there's like I mean, Trevin Merrick is a free agent, Justin Reed is a free agent, Talanoa Hufanga is a free agent. Like there's just a lot of other options that teams could go for. So I do wonder if his market depresses there. Andre Cisco is a free agent, but I do think he's still probably going to get the top deal. Figuring out where he's going to slot in, I think, is a little bit tricky for me. I wonder almost if, like, say the Raiders, do they think that Holland is enough of an upgrade instead of keeping Trevin Merrick in the building that maybe they would go spend for him and get a versatile piece on the back end? I know the Rams typically don't spend at safety, but I think for the way that they run their defense, he would be really, really awesome there. And then similarly, Minnesota. If they want to let Cam Bynum go, get a guy who's a little bit more athletic, it's like, hey, man, this could really be something. So those are the spots that I really like for him.
I want to talk about Minnesota later because I think they're such a blank slate in the secondary and they have money to spend that it can be a fun exercise. Minnesota is not a team that I connected with him just because in my mind, they're going to spread the money out a little bit more. Like last year, they paid Grenard, but other than that, it's a pretty modest deal for Van Ginkel. It's a modest deal for Blake Cashman. Can we get 3 starters instead of 1 for the same price? Looking at just the teams that need safeties and that have the money to spend, there was one that really jumped out to me. It would be a departure from how this staff and this system has valued safeties. So that's a question for me. But Carolina jumps out to me because I think the way they approached the position last year, where they were like, we're going to take some modest swings, right? We're going to go with the Nick Scotts and the Jordan Fullers. I think they learned a lesson at the end of that process and that maybe we need a more real answer at that spot. So they have money to spend, and I think that might be a little bit of an overcorrection to what happened for them last season. Another team that I'm just going to throw out as we talk about the secondary period, because I think that they have money to spend and they have several holes. I'm just curious about how they approach it. I want to see what the Giants do with their secondary and free agency. Do they think it's another safety next to Tyler Nubin? Do they think it's best to spend on a corner opposite Deonte Banks? Like they have multiple holes in their secondary and they have some cash. So how they approach it, that's another team I'll just be watching for a ton of these defensive backs that we're going to be talking about.
That's a really good one because last year, obviously, they were the victim of a free agent walking out the door in Xavier McKinney. And then Xavier McKinney was awesome for the Packers. He was one of the best safeties in the league. So they are now in a spot where they realized, oh, we couldn't replace the guy who was like an all-pro level talent. Maybe we should try to fix that this offseason. And they are lucky that it is a good class to go do that.
I got one more for you. And
Okay.
I'm curious if they think they have in-house options. But just looking at the safety depth charts and thinking about who has money, what about Jevon Holland in Washington?
I would. That one's interesting because in my mind, Holland is a little bit more of a split safety guy where you can move him around a little bit and,
I think
stuff
that's
like
fair.
that.
And with Quan Martin, is a little bit samey? Is there a little bit too much overlap and redundancy? I think that's a fair point to make. But I'm just
that is where I would
sometimes
land.
Stuff is going to sneak up on us,
Yes, exactly. And it could be one of those things like Quinn has shown over the past 3-4 years that he's a little bit more willing to do some of that stuff, even if I think in his heart of hearts he is still a 5-man rush, man free kind of guy. Holland is also like one of those things where he's a good enough player that if they signed it, even if it's a weird fit, I'm like, he can probably make it work.
That's the split safety thing. That's why the Giants and the Panthers to me both make sense. Different sorts of systems, but if you just think about especially the way that Shane Bowen has used safeties in the past, like what Kevin Byard was for him when he was in Tennessee, I do think that spending there wouldn't necessarily be surprising, which is kind of funny that they didn't think keeping Xavier McKinney was worth it at the end of the day. Let's get to Khalil Mack. We alluded to this a little bit earlier. I guess just in light of what we talked about before, if it wasn't the Chargers, who do you think would make the most sense for Khalil Mack at this stage of his career?
So that's the perfect way to frame it. This stage in his career, he's probably only got 1 or 2 more years left. I would imagine he wants to go play for a team that is pretty close to winning. I kind of like the idea of him in Green Bay. I think this is a team that needs to kind of supercharge that front. They have a lot of young players on that front. I think that there would be some value in getting a guy who's a little bit older, who is a little bit more stout in run defense than some of these other guys. Like, I just think that he makes a lot of sense for the youth that they have in the front seven to kind of maybe bring some of that together.
That's interesting. Because they actually moved on from like the two veterans that they had at those spots, right? They had Zadarius Smith at one point. That was several years ago. And then they moved on from Preston Smith at the deadline last year. But Khalil Mack is definitely a better scheme fit for what they want to do now than Preston Smith was. That's why they ended up getting rid of him. So I don't mind that one. I had another NFC North team. What about the Lions? The Lions were intrigued by Myles Garrett last year. I just think if they want to really put this thing over the top, Zadarius Smith is still on that roster, but if you have those three guys, you can move Zadarius Smith inside in certain situations. You can bring Aiden Hutchinson back at the right pace. I just feel like if they're looking at the best way to supercharge this window, a guy like Khalil Mack said yesterday, what's this year's version of the Carlton Davis trade? What's this year's version of the Kevin Zeitler? This is a little bit more expensive than a Kevin Zeitler, but I do think it fits their timeline in a way that does make sense.
And again, it might feel like overkill with obviously Hutchinson there and then Zadarius Smith already, but it's also like how often do we look at a Super Bowl winner or at least a Super Bowl team and just be like, man, they have waves and waves of pass rushers. Yes. Go and get them if you have the money, man. Like, why not?
Is there anybody else? Any other teams? I feel like just going to the line. What's up, Bar?
Let me jump in and give us a taste of what next week's going to be like. Diana Rossini, Adam Schefter out there reporting that Bengals are granting Trey Hendrickson the right to go seek a trade.
Love that because I have some Trey Hendrickson trades a little bit later. You know what? Let's just do it now. If the Packers don't get Khalil Mack, what I had for them was trading for Trey Hendrickson because I think that is the exact type of piece that makes sense for them. Let's just put this thing over the top. So the Trey Hendrickson market, I always thought he was a more realistic option for some of these teams than a Myles Garrett. The Browns do not want to trade Myles Garrett. It would take an astronomical price to get Myles Garrett. So Trey Hendrickson felt like the right consolation prize for these teams that might be in the market. I don't know if the Bengals would be thrilled to like trade him to the Bills, but if you're a team like the Packers and you can just throw a 3 or 2 and change at Cincinnati to get that money off the books, I'd be interested in that. Like that is something I'd absolutely seek out if I were Green Bay.
Dude, if they could do that, we'll talk about it a little bit later, like find some other solution with the cornerback room. You keep Bullard at the nickel. Evan Williams gets back healthy at safety. You could really start to tell yourself a story about where this Green Bay defense might go.
Speaking of that and what they do at corner, let's talk about DJ Reed and where DJ Reed might end up here. What do you think about DJ Reed's market, and is there a landing spot that makes the most sense to you?
DJ Reed is like among the cornerbacks in this group, he was actually like the trickiest for me to like think about where I wanted him to go because with guys like Carlton Davis and Charvarius Ward, just in terms of like style, it's so obvious where they need to go. It's teams like, you know, you want to play for Dan Quinn. If Brian Flores wants to go get his man coverage guys who can punch you in the face, like to me stylistically, it's very obvious. And then if you go down a little bit further on the cornerback list, you get guys like Byron Murphy and Asante Samuel, guys who are like very obvious zone corners, or it's just nickels. Mm-hmm. So like DJ Reed is in this weird spot where he's more of a number 2, but the stylistic thing is a little bit trickier for me to find. I could still see a team though, like maybe Jacksonville really wants a guy opposite of Campbell. I think a team like that could actually make a lot of sense if they want to like rejuvenate their secondary. So just teams like that who are looking for a firmly above average number 2 corner. And I think some people are going to say off of last year, oh, well, it wasn't his best year. Listen, man, nobody on the Jets defense had their best year last year. I don't even care about any of that. Like, who cares? So he'll probably be better in 2025.
I actually liked him in Green Bay. If I was trying to put a cornerback on the Packers, he was the guy that came to mind for me because, you know, the way they played quarters in with the Jets, he can play a little bit more aggressive. He can play up near the line of scrimmage, but he is a zone corner. So I just think that he gives the Packers the optionality they didn't have last year because of who their outside corners were. Let's just run through all of these guys because I think that they're all kind of tiered in a similar place. They're just different flavors of player. So if that's your thought about DJ Reed, where would you like to see a guy like Charvarius Ward go?
I mean, like I said, if Brian Flores really wants to go get his man coverage guy, it's somebody like Charvarius Ward. I think that would make a ton of sense. I know the Rams irritate me with what they do on defense. They need a bully on the outside, but like they just, I don't know, they seem to refuse to spend the money.
I think that I wouldn't be looking at it that way.
You think they might?
Oh yeah. If there's a corner worth spending on there, they've done it in the past. I think not having Jordan and I have talked about this over the years, where just this idea of having like something to rotate your secondary around, right? Like there's a centerpiece that everything else kind of gravitationally rotates around. They don't have that in the secondary right now. They've got guys like that up front, but being able to have one guy on the outside to be like, he's your FU player at corner. I absolutely think that that's something that would be worth seeking out, given some of the flexibility that they have right now. So somebody like Ward there, that's interesting to me.
They really should do it, man. They need a bully on the outside. Obviously, he's not the caliber of player that Jalen Ramsey was, but like that was part of the appeal with him, was that he is a bully and you can one-on-one just trust him on the boundary. The last team I'll throw in here, again, if Dan Quinn is actually not going to lean into as much of the cover 2 stuff as we thought, getting a man coverage guy like Charvarius Ward in Washington would be just phenomenal.
Yeah, I like that. In this version of it, you'd be moving Mikey Sainer still back to the slot with Marshawn Lattimore there. Okay,
yeah,
that makes a lot of sense.
And like Sainer still was obviously good outside given all the circumstances and stuff, but I think given the way that he hits and tackles, ideally I would want him in the nickel because I just feel like that's where you get the most out of his skill set.
What about Byron Murphy? Again, slightly different flavor of player, but is there a team in your mind that makes sense for him?
I kind of think Minnesota should like maybe just keep him. Like if they in their minds can't get to the man coverage world, like I could see them keeping a guy like Byron Murphy. If Pittsburgh, I think, wants to solve their problem outside of Joey Porter on the other side, I think that he could make some sense for them. Yeah, because like how long have they not had a number 2 corner outside of?
So true.
Yeah, like it's been a while, so I think that he would make a lot of sense for them. So those are kind of the teams I'm looking at. Or if you kind of mentioned with Shane Bowen, the way that he likes to run his defense with a lot more of the zone coverage stuff. I think maybe in New York he could make some sense too. The Giants.
It's funny because I had Rasul Douglas going to the Giants. That was my corner I would throw in the Giants. Again, all these guys, like I think they're probably going to get paid at a similar level. Some of them are more specific to certain schemes, but I think they're all like just slightly different flavors of one another. So depending on what you want, it'll be interesting to see where those guys get placed here over the next week or so. Let's keep running through these. Milton Williams, the man who is probably about to make $20-ish million a year when you look at the Osia Odighizuwa contract. I had a hard time with this, like finding the perfect pairing. Like there's some teams that I would run through. I'd be like, all right, I would love him in like Houston, right? They need interior defensive players, but like there's probably not a chance they can afford him given some of the other things that they've had to spend money on and how much they're already allocating their defensive line. I like him in Minnesota as a team that needs interior defensive line help, but I don't think they can afford him because I think they're probably going to spread out the money a little bit more than that. I like him with the Giants as a complementary piece to Dexter Lawrence, but they've already paid Dexter Lawrence. They've already paid Brian Burns. Can they afford to spend more money on their defensive front? So I think he's a good player. There just wasn't a marriage that made immediate sense to me as I was looking for the teams that have a need and the resources to make something like this happen.
What about Arizona? I don't
hate that at all.
They have more money than they probably know what to do with. He has experience with the head coach there, Jonathan Gannon.
That's right.
The other thing is, too, there are obviously going to be some free agents in this class who are a little bit older. Maybe they want to go play for a winner. Milton Williams just won a Super Bowl, and he's like entering the prime of his career. Go get some money, man. Go make some money. Arizona could probably pay you more than almost any other team in the league. So, like, for both parties, I feel like that's just a marriage that makes too much sense.
It's funny because the other team I had that I felt best about when I was landing on this was Atlanta. Just because they're going to be in a 4-down world now. They need pass rush juice somewhere, whether it's the defensive tackles, the defensive ends. If they end up moving on from Grady Jarrett and Onyemata, which I think they might, and the amount of money they would save by doing that, is Milton Williams their sort of guy. You could say a lot of the same things for Arizona. These teams that have just been like pass rush starved over the last few years and have the money to do it, I think he makes sense for both of them.
Yeah, if Atlanta can find the money, they need pass rush anywhere, like you said, so bad. I still think I would like to see it off the edge because, again, we've made the jokes. We haven't seen it in 2 decades there, but anywhere they can get it, I'm sure they would be happy with it.
Well, speaking of that, let's get to Josh Sweat. So Milton Williams' teammate, who is also going to be a free agent. Atlanta, again, is a team that I do think makes sense for him if they can free up the money. The other team that I'll throw out for Josh Sweat, because I'm just tempted to throw every pass rusher on this team and the Packers, given where they are right now, Josh Sweat in Buffalo.
Oh, that actually stylistic, like, because they are not a team that, how do I say it? Like, they don't necessarily build like the Saints used to, where it's like we need 280-pound defensive ends. They're
but
more
they
okay with
long
like
guys,
right? They like long guys, and like if you're 260 and under, that's okay with them. Like they don't necessarily need the biggest guys. Josh Sweat kind of matches all that, and he actually does play like bigger than his size. He's a very physical player, especially against the run. So that's a fit I actually really like. I'm into that one.
Who are your Josh Sweat teams?
I mean, if Washington wants to spend the money, I mean, Dan Quinn could always use pass rushers. Like that is one that makes a lot of sense to me.
They had a lot of rotational pieces last year, essentially, other than Dorrance Armstrong. He's the only one they actually spent money on a multi-year deal. So I think that's a good one. Washington in general, just give me your high-priced defensive free agents. We have the money to do it.
They're going to sign at least one of the big-ticket guys. It would be shocking if they didn't. And then the other one I would throw out there, honestly, the Chargers, like if, depending on what the Chargers want to do with Khalil Mack, I think you could get like pretty similar level of play from a guy like Sweat. And he's obviously much younger, and he could kind of be like a newer cornerstone piece for you, whereas Mack, maybe you only have 1 or 2 more years left of this. So if that's the direction they want to go, that could make some sense to me.
I meant to ask you this when we were talking about the corners. Is there a corner you like for the Chargers specifically? Because this is a team where, Cam Hart is coming back, but Asante Samuel Jr. and Christian Fulton both hitting free agency. They have money to spend. They probably need another outside corner at the end of this process. Is there somebody that's available that you think makes sense for the Chargers?
Yeah, so for as much as I've talked about re-sign Mack, maybe sign Sweat, my ideal defensive game plan for the Chargers this offseason is take whatever pass rusher in the first round, and then in free agency, go sign Carlton Davis, dude. Carlton Davis and Cam Hart, that is like the longest cornerback duo in the NFL already, and they both just want to punch you in the face. Like it is a cornerback duo built to warm my heart. I need it.
Yeah, I like that a lot, actually. I can just see him in the uniform, and having those two guys standing next to each other, I'm very into that as an idea. Let's get to a couple of these safeties. There's a couple I'm going to say for the best fits, because I think that they're guys that maybe aren't necessarily the big ticket guys, but I could see them landing in certain places. The 2 guys I would throw at the top of this list are probably Cam Bynum and Justin Reed after Jevon Holland. Cam Bynum specifically, where do you think Cam Bynum makes the most sense?
So I really would, I know I mentioned earlier at the top, like Jevon Holland to Minnesota could make a lot of sense, but like I also think because Cam Bynum has just been such a nice piece for Minnesota for a while, I wouldn't mind if they just kind of kept him around. The Rams, I think he actually makes a lot of sense with a lot of the stuff that they do, like kind of replacing, like if they, I mean, actually maybe he's a little bit too samey with Cam Curl, so maybe I don't actually love that the more I think about it. But you mentioned the Giants earlier, like they could use another split safety guy. I think he makes a lot of sense. So I think Bynum is going to kind of be whoever doesn't get Jevon Holland, this is our consolation prize.
It's fun that I think that makes total sense. The team I throw out for both Cam Bynum and Justin Reed is the Colts, because you have these 2 guys, and I think that it's funny that they're hitting free agency at the same time. You have these 2 guys who play in these split safety defenses that are just weird as hell. They're doing so many different things. They're clearly very smart players. And that sort of safety with Lou Anarumo, based on like the sort of stuff he's going to want to try on the back end, I would like to see them add that sort of veteran piece, whether it's Cam Bynum or Justin Reed. I think both of them make sense for what the Colts are going to want to do on defense this year.
I love that, because that was the whole thing with Jesse Bates, is like that's what they were able to do with him, and then as soon as he walked out the door, they realized all the 24-year-old safeties they had were not going to cut it. So I actually do love that. Like money-wise, Bynum probably makes more sense for them, but if they could land Justin Reed one way or another, like he is somehow, despite playing for the Chiefs, one of the more underrated safeties in the league, it feels like. Like I just feel like he doesn't quite get talked about in the top tier, but he's going to make somebody very happy this offseason.
All right, so for the linebackers here, I just want to do a rapid fire round. I'm going to say a name. I want to know where you would like this guy to land. Let's start with Dre Greenlaw. Where do you want to see Dre Greenlaw end up?
It needs to be Cincinnati. Cincinnati should pay the premium, because we talked about this like a month ago. It's like you need ass kickers. Dre Greenlaw, maybe he's trying to kick ass a little bit too much and he might run himself out of a play, but he is going to kick ass and they need that.
Ernest Jones.
So this is boring, but he should stay in Seattle. I think it just makes more sense for everybody because of some of the knee stuff. Like, they're familiar with him. It feels like he should just stay there.
Nick Bolton.
The Commanders. I think he should be the Bobby Wagner replacement. I think he's like he plays very similarly to Bobby Wagner, where it's like really good in between the tackles right now. Coverage wise, he gets it mentally, but can be a little bit slow. And then outside the numbers, he can get there on some stuff, but maybe every now and then he's going to lose the angle. Like, I think he's just kind of a younger version of what they had in Bobby.
Jamie Sherwood, formerly of the Jets.
So because he's kind of a former safety, a little bit smaller, somewhere like Tennessee, where you can play behind Jeffrey Simmons and Tavondra Sweat, like, you're going to be protected there. So that makes sense to me.
I really like him. I'm curious about where he ends up. He flies around. He is a little bit undersized, but I was very impressed with the way that he played this year, as the rest of that defense was just imploding around him based on just the pure, just disgusting vibes that were unfolding with that team throughout the entire year. So he's somebody I'm keeping an eye on. Two more smaller ones here. Robert Spillane.
So I kind of like him on the Chargers, actually. Stick around in the AFC West, because last year they obviously they brought Denzel Perriman back into the building. Just a headhunter. Just wants to kill guards in between the tackles and stuff like that. It's exactly what Spillane is, and he's a younger and better version of that. So
the only thing I was also trying to put a linebacker on the Chargers, but they drafted Junior Colson last year in the third round, and they still have Deion Henley. So I'm wondering, do they want to see if Colson's going to develop before they cut that off by signing a veteran to supplant him? That would be my only thing that I would say to that.
That's a good point. That I kind of forgot that, like, because Colson didn't play a lot last year.
He didn't.
But yeah, maybe he will next year. And obviously that staff is very familiar with him because it's half the staff is from Michigan, and that's where Colson played. So,
all right, let's get to some of our favorite fits with maybe not the guys at the top of these lists, but guys that are worthwhile players to be chasing here as part of this process. Your favorite fit team-wise that we have not talked about to this point.
So we just joked like 5 minutes ago that the Commanders will pay one of these big ticket guys. It could be anybody. Like, you could sell me on literally any defensive position and I'd probably buy it. I kind of think it should be Milton Williams, just because Jonathan Allen has requested a trade. Daron Payne was not very good last year. And I know they drafted Trezon Newton and he was actually solid, when he was playing, but like, for a defense that really likes to get home with their 4-man pass rush, this is maybe the best way for them to facilitate that. So especially if they trade Jonathan Allen, this would make a lot of sense for them.
That's tough for me. The idea that you're going to move on from $15 million of Jonathan Allen and then just give it to Milton Williams, you're getting younger, right? You're getting 6 years younger. Unhappy,
Jonathan Allen. Like, I probably would just keep Jonathan Allen, but in terms of, like, if Allen is unhappy and he doesn't like being there, doesn't like playing there, they can just move on from him and replace him.
Just feels like a lot of resources to spend at one particular position. They've done it before. They drafted Jerry Newton last year when they already had these two guys, but I think the only real argument for that is you're just getting younger. You're literally getting like 6 years younger if you sign Milton Williams instead of Jonathan Allen, which I guess I understand. My first one here, definitely not getting younger, but one that I would like to see. Calais Campbell goes to the Lions.
You're just bringing all the mercenary, like, 36-year-old ass kickers, which I actually love. Well, it's what they need.
Khalil Mack is probably a pipe dream, right? Like, Khalil Mack, that may not happen. Calais Campbell, you can get for like a few $1,000,000. And the reason I think this makes sense, look at the guys they've had on the interior next to Aleem McNeil, the body types that they've sought out there. Like, Levi Onwuzurike is a big, long player. It's exactly what you're getting from Calais Campbell. So you pop him in next to Aleem McNeil. It gives you a body type you've had in that defense before, and I think it makes sense as part of the rotation that they're trying to put together. The other guy I throw in, is, as long as we're doing it, if they don't get either one of those guys, DeMarcus Lawrence. Like, 1 year of DeMarcus Lawrence just dropped into the overall, like, 5-6 man rotation you have on your defensive line. I really want the Lions to seek out one of these players. I don't know why it means so much to me, but just these, like, older, we got one more year, one last ride type guys, I think they make sense for where the Lions are right now.
Well, and Lawrence also makes sense to me from the perspective of, like, they tried basically signing DeMarcus Lawrence last year with Marcus Davenport. Like, it was the same type of bet. Yeah. Like, okay, guy who's a little bit injured, but he's longer and fits our play style. You know, he's really rugged. Like, signing DeMarcus Lawrence would be just like that signing 2.0.
Rugged is the exact word that I'm looking for. And that's what these guys are. Like, these are not like DPR, like bendy type guys. We're talking about big physical dudes and all the people I'm trying to put on the Lions. So I think I'm in the right zip code here. I don't think I'm out of line in what I'm trying to do, even if all three of them is probably one step over the line.
You've named enough of them that I would now be shocked if they didn't at least get one of these guys one way or another.
Going back to what we were talking about at the beginning of the show, what do you think this is? This is a strategy. if I just list off 20 guys going to one team, I will get one of them right.
There you go.
What's your next one?
So we talked about a little bit, teased the Packers corners. I think Paulson Adebo kind of makes a lot of sense for them, especially, I think he's kind of similar to the way that he plays a little bit to Jair Alexander. I think he's a little bit bigger, but like Adebo has been a guy who I think, especially if they want to do some of their zone stuff, I think he could be just fantastic for them. Obviously get a little bit younger. Like, I just think he makes sense for them in terms of not swinging on the tippy-tip top tier of the cornerback market with a Carlton Davis or whoever, but getting that next tier down where it's like, okay, this guy can give us something.
And Paulson Adebo, we've seen him play at a really high level for stretches. I mean, I think he's really good example of just how volatile cornerback play can be from year to year. And there's a chance you have to pay for those high flashes just because he is a young player. Again, there aren't that many second contract guys that are available in this year's free agent class. So there's a chance you have to pay a premium for that, and you're not buying the dip as much as you'd want to. But I think that one makes a lot of sense and is one I would also keep an eye on. Two guys I wanted to send to the Jets as they kind of rebuild that defense around the pillars that they have. Mentioned them a little bit earlier, but like Levi Onwuzurike next to Quinnen Williams, I would be into something like that. Familiarity with Aaron Glenn, obviously. The other one I had, this is a team that kind of has to rebuild their entire safety room, which you're going to point out here in a second with the next one that you have. I kind of like Andre Cisco going to the Jets.
That makes a lot of sense.
Something akin to like what they have in Kirby Joseph, a guy who gets his hands on the ball. Like I just feel like stylistically what Kirby Joseph has been for the Lions, he's been a phenomenal player, but we've seen Andre Cisco play well at times for the Jags. And so somebody like him locking down the back half of that defense for the Jets, I actually think that one makes a lot of sense.
So I had Justin Reed, but I actually think because of the stylistic thing, Cisco does make more sense because part of why Kirby Joseph really worked in the Aaron Glenn defense is he's a gambler. But with the way that they run the defense where it's like, dude, we're sending 5 and 6, we're playing a ton of man coverage, you have a little bit of the freedom to go gamble and like really get the high reward stuff out of that. Cisco, that's all that he wants to do, and we've seen him play really at a high level without some of the injuries and stuff, so even though I had Justin Reed, I actually like Andre Cisco more now. I like that better.
Good. I'm glad I could sell you on that because that was one of my favorite ones. I could just see it, right? Like I could just see him in the uniform. I can see him on the back end of that defense. That was one of them that really spoke to me as I was going through this list. All right, so moving on from Justin Reed, your next one.
Yeah, so if the Rams want to do something at cornerback, maybe a little bit of a cheaper option because this guy's a little bit older in his career, you might only get 1 or 2 years out of him. I really like Mike Hilton playing the nickel for the Rams. Like just the guy who, because they do some of their too high stuff, you really need a nickel who can defend the run. Mike Hilton is very excited to do that all of the time. He's also a really, really good blitzer, which I think we saw from Chris Shula, especially down the stretch of the season. They were actually pretty good at sending some of that stuff. So I just think stylistically, like, he just makes so much sense. And also just like get an adult in that DB room. Like you've got a lot of younger guys. You're unsure where it's going to go. To just have like a glue type piece like Hilton just makes so much sense to me.
All right, speaking of the Bengals, you and I both had this one. And this is the one that has spoken to me most throughout this entire process. Can we just put DJ Jones on the Bengals? Can we just make this happen? Can we get one run-stuffing player on this team who desperately needs it? He's probably going to be available at a reasonable price. This is his 3rd contract. He's a specific sort of player that really kind of only does one thing well, but is a thing they need to do well. So putting DJ Jones and Dre Greenlaw on the Bengals is all I want at the end of this process.
If they sign those 2 guys, I don't even care like what the rest of the offseason looks like. You kept T around, even though it's probably should have extended him instead of tag, whatever. That's a different discussion. You kept one of your best players around.
By the way.
That could still happen. That's true. given the franchise, I'm not sure it will, but we'll see. And then, but with like if they got in DJ Jones and Dre Greenlaw, I think we joked before, it's an eat your vegetables type of defensive offseason for them. This is the exact type of guys that they need.
You already mentioned Khalil Mack to the Packers. That was another one of yours. What is your last one here? Your favorite fits of this group?
My last one, and this is a player that I think is kind of underrated, and I feel like he was constantly misused with New York. Azeez Ojulari is like quietly a very good player. I think a team like the San Francisco 49ers, or if the Eagles want to go a little bit cheaper to replace Josh Sweat, I think both of those teams could make a lot of sense for a guy like Azeez Ojulari. Like, Azeez Ojulari is kind of like a 75% version of what Josh Sweat is to begin with. So, like, the Eagles in particular, I think would make so much sense.
How the Niners specifically rebuild that defensive front this offseason through free agency and the draft, I absolutely think is something worth watching, because it kind of worries me a little bit because Azeez Ojulari and Leonard Floyd, they're just like have similar shades of one another, like body type, background, everything. And so there's a little part of me that's just like, are we doing this again? But he's so much younger. And so I think that there's absolutely an argument to be made about that. This entire second contract group of younger pass rushers in this class is interesting to me, because you have Ojulari, and then the two guys that I was curious about, Dayo Odangbo, who was solid for the Colts, but good enough where he's probably going to get paid because he's been a mildly productive pass rusher. And then the other guy that I'm really curious about, because I thought he was playing really, really well 2 years ago before he got hurt, is Malcolm Kuntz. Like, how good do people think Malcolm Kuntz is going to be coming off of injury? Because he was really showing some flashes 2 years ago. The two teams that I was throwing out, the Panthers have a ton of money to spend, and they need pass rushers. So a guy like Dayo to the Panthers, I think, could make some sense. I feel like they're probably going to be searching for somebody like that. And then the Bears still need another edge rusher. And even if you think you can find that guy at 10, because now you've freed yourself up a little bit with the offensive line trades that you've made, a guy like Kuntz opposite Montez Sweat, who is a little bit smaller, can be your right defensive end. You don't really have to worry about him, defending the run to the same extent. He's somebody skill set wise that I actually think could make a lot of sense if the Bears want to free themselves up for what they could do with the 10th overall pick.
I actually like both of those, because even though I think Azeez Ojulari is probably a higher floor player than both of those, I think for like the Niners and the Eagles, that makes more sense, right? Like, you already have your elite players. You just need to go sign some higher floor guys like an Azeez Ojulari. Whereas with the Panthers and the Bears, you're not sure how close you are. You're not sure how good your fronts are going to be. It makes a little bit more sense to swing on some of these younger guys who have a little bit more untapped potential. And especially in the case of Kuntz, where it's like, he might have been on a really nice upward trajectory. It's just the injury got in the way. And so I think for both of these teams, that makes a ton of sense.
That's exactly where I'm at. Is they're early enough in the process where you want to give yourself a little bit of runway with how you're building on that side of the ball specifically. When you have Caleb Williams getting 32-year-old Joe Thuney, we just need something now. Like, this is all about right now. On defense, I think you want to give yourself a little bit more wiggle room than that. So trying to get one of these younger pieces, that's where my head's at with that one. So I feel like we're on the same page there. Let's talk about a couple of the potential landmines in this free agency group. We did this on offense yesterday. Just a couple of the guys that, are good players, but there might be a little buyer beware there. So who are those guys for you on defense?
I mean, obviously Hassan Reddick, right? Like, it's almost not even worth talking about. He didn't play football last year, so that someone will sign him, and I'm very curious on what the money will look like. But that's, to me, I think we can just cast that aside. The other one to me, in terms of like bigger ticket guys, is Joey Bosa. He's just getting older. Like, a lot of the injury history stuff is pretty concerning to me. Even though he still can play at a relatively high level, you can see that he just doesn't have the juice that he had earlier in his career. So I just wonder if you're paying for a guy who is on the wrong side of the hill. And I think for a lot of teams, that just might not be a gamble that makes a lot of sense.
I mean, I would be shocked if he signed anything more than a 1-year deal somewhere. Like, I'd be shocked based on where he is in his career and what the injury history has looked like. And we didn't really talk about this at the top. I think it's worth talking about. The what if with Joey Bosa sucks. Like, I mean, Joey Bosa, the best version of his career, he's like a Hall of Fame type talent. And we just never really got to see it because of all of the injuries. It's really shitty when you actually think about what he could have been and what he ended up being for that team.
he was basically as good as his brother is. Like, they were both that level of talent, like, just insanely good. Like, I remember certain moments with Joey Bosa where, like, he's defending zone read and he's, squeezing the line to make sure the running back doesn't get caught, and the quarterback gets out the back end, and he just instantly pounces and flies to the perimeter and catches him. And it's like, there's not a lot of defensive ends who in their prime could really move like that and cover that kind of ground. Obviously, he was a phenomenal pass rusher. The technique was incredible. Like, the fact that there was always something in the way for him is a little bit, it just sucks.
Two guys I'll throw out here. Milton Williams, to me, feels like a potential landmine. This is a guy who's never played more than 653 snaps in a season, and that included 4 playoff games this year. 4 playoff games, he got to 653 snaps. So he's always been a part-time player, and he's a very specific sort of player. When he can be used as like a pass rusher first and foremost, and that's what role he plays, where he's maybe the second or even third most important piece on your defensive line, we've seen him thrive in that role. If you're paying him $20 million a year, that's an entirely different place in the hierarchy. So I do think talent-wise, he could potentially do that, but I think you have to admit that there's a little bit of risk here and a little bit of projection with somebody like him, even if I do think it might be worth betting on. And then the other one that's I think a little bit clear, Talanoa Hufanga is like, in the best case scenario, you pay him $10 million a year for the next 2 years and he plays 11 games for you. Like, I think that there's a very real chance that that's something that we're looking at.
I think both of those are fair. Like, with Milton Williams, there are some free agents where you like to be like, okay, this guy played a limited role on this team, we can go pay him. But those are usually like your tier 3 free agents. It's not usually your tier 1 guys, and that is a little bit the difference. The reason I put Milton Williams specifically to Washington is like, they're kind of okay with those guys, like Dan Quinn specifically, with guys who are just pass rushers. Like, it's what Osa was for him for a long time in Dallas. So, like, I think that is why that one made sense to me.
But when you're paying that guy $20 million a year, the calculus changes, right? Like, the dollar per snap thing, the math shifts in a way that I think is at least worth acknowledging.
It's definitely scary. And that's always the thing with, like, these tip-top free agents, right? Is you are making some sort of bet. At least he's younger, right? And so maybe there's a chance that he can just continue to develop. But the fact that we've never seen it before in terms of volume is a little bit scary. And then Hufanga, he has my heart in every way, but he is a threat to himself the way that he plays. And he's also just stylistically not going to be a fit for everybody. So I could see him being a little bit of a landmine depending on who is actually giving him like serious looks this free agency.
Again, high upside, high downside with a guy like that. If it hits and he stays healthy, he's going to be a nice piece in your defense. But we've seen him struggle to stay healthy.
Can I throw in one more?
You sure can.
Tershawn Wharton from the Chiefs. He has been a guy who I think is probably going to get not tier 1 defensive tackle money, but somebody is going to pay him to be like, this can be a starting defensive tackle for us. I think for basically as long as Steve Spagnuolo and Chris Jones have been in Kansas City, none of the other defensive tackles have actually been that good, and there's a reason that they consistently rotate them the way that they do. I'm a little bit nervous of Wharton leaving that particular ecosystem and what that might look like for somebody.
I love that we're just talking about teams regretting signing Tershawn Wharton. We're at that stage of the proceedings in our free agency discourse here. Let's get to some guys that we think might provide some bang for their buck in this year's free agent class. Dudes who might be this year's version of Zack Baun, just hidden gems that we think could end up outperforming whatever modest contract they end up getting. Who do you got for me?
I'm going to lean really far into the theme here of Wisconsin linebacker, but Jack Sanborn is a good player, man. He's been on the Bears for a while as a backup for them. He was a UDFA, I think, 3 years ago. He is a legitimate, like, starting caliber linebacker to me. It's just that he had only, I think, played 1 year, and then the Bears went out and like completely fixed their linebacker room with Edmonds and TJ Edwards, who are better than him, to be clear. But like, Sanborn is probably only like a tier and a half below that. Like, this is a guy where I think somebody could sign him for like $2 million a year, and he's just going to be a perfectly capable starting linebacker for them. He's like pretty smart in coverage. He's willing to hit against the run. He's just a middling athlete, and you kind of have to live with that, but he's going to make somebody happy.
Yeah, I like that one because, again, you can figure out a reason why he's hitting free agency. They've invested at that position. He was the odd man out, so I think that makes a ton of sense. Who else you got?
I've got a couple.
Let's run through a couple more years.
Yeah. Asante Samuel, I think he kind of just got pushed out of the Chargers just because body type wise, he doesn't make a lot of sense to them. But he could be like somebody's Byron Murphy for like, what the Vikings did a couple of years ago. So he makes sense to me.
I like that.
And then
similar to Byron Murphy. Byron Murphy had to sign a 1-year deal because he had an injury history. Is that something that could also happen with Asante Samuel? I like that one. I think that makes a lot of sense.
And then I have two defensive tackles who are very different from each other. Kevin Givens from the 49ers. Probably not a starter for you, but he actually has some juice as a rotational pass rusher. So if that's something that somebody really needs, he could make sense. And then the one that I really love, Adam Butler from the Raiders, man. He is a really, really good run defender. Like, insanely good run defender.
We're going so deep here, but I also like Adam Butler.
But, and like, on the free agency show, we did the, like, what are positions you can get bang for your buck? And one of them I said was the run defending defensive tackle. You could probably sign Butler. Butler is not going to cost you any more than, like, $4 million a year. And he will give you 25 to 30 snaps of really good run defense. Go sign that, man.
It's really funny because I've always liked Kevin Givens. I always feel like Kevin Givens is a guy that pops when you watch that team play. Yeah, he just been somebody that brings the energy that you want from that system, right? Like he just fits their play style. And then Adam Butler is somebody that I remember being at Raiders camp last year and talking to Patrick Graham. And I was like, I kind of like John Jenkins and Adam Butler. Like the rotation that you guys have along your defensive front. These are all players I like. And he was kind of like, yeah, it's why we brought him back and da-da-da-da-da. And so Adam Butler is somebody that when you watch that Raiders team play, he does pop a little bit more than you might expect him to. Speaking of Raiders, I had Nate Hobbs on mine. We talked about a couple of these guys on the mailbag show that we did. Nate Hobbs is somebody that was a nickel corner for the Raiders. We've seen him play at a high level. He's had some injury issues. If you could kind of buy low on him on a 1-year deal, I think there's potential upside there. I like Ife Melifonwu. I think that in the right situation, he can be a useful piece for your defense because he can do a bunch of different stuff. He can play in the slot. He can play safety. He can blitz a little bit. He's a crazy good athlete. Again, somebody who's struggled to stay healthy. This is somebody that I just have always liked for the specific role he plays, and you can see why they can't retain him because of how much capital they spent in this area. Bobby Brown, formerly of the Rams, as just like a run-stuffing piece, he's 24 years old, and I just think he's had some really nice moments for what he is as a player. So if you're trying to build your defensive line rotation, I like him. And then two guys who were on the Cardinals last year. One, I'm keeping a candle lit for Baron Browning. I'm not giving up. Like what Baron Browning is capable of as a rotational pass rusher, somebody I think 1 year, $5 million, just bet on the upside, see what you can get. That's somebody that I would like to see land on a good defense. And somebody who, this is just way, way, way down any sort of free agent list you're going to look at. Victor Dimukeje from the Cardinals. He's somebody that's never really figured it out. This is somebody, he didn't get a ton of even playing time for a team that needed pass rushers. And so this probably sounds insane, but I just like some of the stuff I've seen from him. He's explosive and maybe on his first contract couldn't figure it out, but that's somebody that if I were just looking for upside and some juice for pretty much free, I'm intrigued by him. Like, I think he is somebody that could have a future in the league if he finds himself in the right situation.
I think both of those guys are going to be, for the next 4 years, someone is going to keep trying to make it work. Whether or not it ever will, who knows? But somebody is going to keep trying to make it work. And honestly, with Melifonwu, like who you mentioned earlier, Jeremy Chin for Washington is a free agent. If they want to go make like a cheaper bet at like a similar-ish style of player and fill that role, get like the J-Ron Curse, what he used to be in Dallas.
It's a great call.
I kind of love it.
It's a great call. I like that a lot, actually. All right, let's run through some realistic veteran trades that we might like to see over the next week or so. What do you got for me?
I'll start with Jair Alexander. It just seems like he's not happy with Green Bay. Green Bay kind of wants to do something different at corner. They've got a new defensive coordinator in there. So maybe sending him to, I actually struggled to nail down an exact team, but Giants make sense. Raiders kind of make sense. Like just one of those type of defenses I think could make sense for him.
Yeah, I think that's a good one. Again, we've kind of danced around corner to the Giants, what that might look like. I like that one. My first one was Trey Hendrickson to the Packers. So now that Trey Hendrickson is officially able to explore a trade, that one's easy. This is the one I tried to do yesterday, and before realizing it was all offensive players. This one's kind of weird, and I don't know if the team that has him now would want to do it based on where they are. But if they're trying to save money, the idea of Danico Autry going to the Bengals is intriguing to me. The Texans are up against it money-wise. There's some things that they could do. They could make Shaq Mason a post-June 1st cut. There are other things that they can do, whatever. But they would save a decent chunk of money if they were to trade Denico Autry, who's an older player, free agent after this season. A guy like that in the overall equation of the Bengals defense as we're seeking out ass kickers. I don't know. There's just something about that makes sense to me as I'm thinking about it.
More ass kickers. They need to be gluttonous with the ass kickers this offseason. So if they can get Dre Greenlaw, DJ Jones, sprinkle into Denico Autry in there, you're solving the violence problem very quickly.
There's a chance that the Texans think we're a contender right now. Why would we get rid of a guy who makes our defensive line go, especially because we don't really have other interior pieces? So there's a shot that Duke Tobin calls Nick Caserio, but I still feel like stylistically that is a phone call I would make if I were the Cincinnati Bengals. He's making like $8 million against the cap this year. Like, I just don't think you're going to get a better interior presence. Think about what Denico Autry was doing in the back half of last season. That to me is a potential gamble worth making if I am the Bengals.
They should, like you said, at least pick up the phone, see what's going on.
Your next one here is a team that I want to talk a little bit more about. So what is the other realistic veteran trade that you had on your radar?
So kind of like the Sanborn thing, I'm going back to another backup linebacker who I think has played admirably well when asked to, Dorian Williams of the Bills. He's got some limitations. He's a little bit shorter in terms of his arms. Coverage can be up and down, but man, he flies to the ball. He reads his keys really well. He's willing to hit. You know who could really use a linebacker because they're losing their veteran and the other guy wasn't good last year? The Tampa Bay Bucks. And so I think if they can send like some sort of cheap day 3 pick and go get Dorian Williams, give themselves a chance to see how he plays on, I think, maybe the last year of his deal, and then maybe potentially pay him. Go find a solution that way.
The Bucs defense in general is just something I haven't really thought a lot about and should think more about. This is a team that's in the playoffs consistently. Their offensive personnel is really good. They have some pieces on that defense to remake. Who's going to be your other edge rusher opposite Diaby? Who's going to be your corners, period? Because it seems like they might move on from Jamel Dean. There are ways they can free up some space. With Winfield and Wirfs, they can free up some money if they want to. So I'll be curious to see if they do that and allows them to be a little bit more aggressive in the market, because they're one of these teams. Carlton Davis is obviously there, but where are they going to get that corner? Where are they going to get that other pass rusher? Are they going to be a team that's in the mix for some of these second-tier pass rushers that we're talking about? I did have a Bucs trade, though. And this one, to me, like, we're swinging for the fences here. I can understand why, again, the team that has him now would say no, but another free agent next offseason, a team that's kind of in this transitional period right now. If I were the Bucs, I'm calling the Dolphins about Jalen Phillips.
Okay, that is the type of bet they need. They need some sort of juice. I kind of like it. I agree with you, though. I don't know if because the Dolphins are losing some of their other pieces, I don't know if they would want to do this, but he does have the injury history, so maybe that moves them off of it.
He has the injury history. Again, this is a team that who knows what they're going to look like beyond 2025. There's a chance, again, like the Texans, they say, all of our chips are pushed in here. Like, we can't afford to walk away from this guy, but he's coming off of another injury. They just touched Bradley Chubb's contract and redid that, so that gives them a little bit of flexibility, but they have Chop Robinson there now. It's a phone call I would make if I were a team in the Bucs position, even though there's a chance that they would just never do it. And the last one I would throw out, I don't have a team, but just a guy I would call about as we think about the up and down nature of cornerback play, trying to buy the dip a little bit. I would call the Browns about Martin Emerson if I needed a cornerback. I would at least call. We've seen him play at a reasonably high level for stretches. He probably won't cost you very much. They're in a position where Greg Newsome is a free agent. They've already paid Denzel Ward. And they're another team that is in this kind of weird limbo where I would at least pick up the phone if I wanted what might be a low-cost dice roll on somebody that can play man coverage and we have seen be a good player in the league.
So if you're like the Jets and you want to let DJ Reed walk, that's just probably like a low risk gamble that makes a lot of sense for them stylistically. Like that is a team that I would love to go see make this play.
Just call, just see if like, all right, can we throw them a mid to like late pick? And just because they're not interested in retaining him, because again, they've already paid one corner. If they want to pay Newsome, like it's just, there's so many things in transition there that it's a phone call that I would make if I were a team that needed cornerback help and maybe didn't want to spend on some of these guys who are going to be much more expensive on the open market. The Jalen Phillips Tampa one is my favorite one because I think that's just there's a chance the Dolphins have no interest in that, but he hasn't been extended yet. He has an injury history. And if I'm a team like the Bucs, that is like the sort of high upside swing that I think you might need to take.
I will say, because of his own injury history and because of how good Chop looked, there is like some incentive for them to be like, you know what, we can live with moving on from Jalen Phillips in a way that typically with a pass rusher of this caliber, teams might not want to part with.
Man, just seeing the language here on this Trey Hendrickson thing, it really does feel like this is over. So we'll see who gets in the Trey Hendrickson market and if it is in fact a team like the Green Bay Packers. For now, that is all we've got from the free agency side of things. We're going to get to our discussion with our Lions writer, Colton Pouncy, here in a second as we keep rolling with our Teams on the Cusp series. Joining us now, it is our Lions writer here at The Athletic, Colton Pouncy, keeping our Teams on the Cusp series rolling here. Colton, it's good to see you, man. How you doing?
I'm okay. Surviving Combine Week. Got one more day and get out of here and go back to life.
It's all about just surviving and advancing.
Right.
That's what this week is all about. It's just about getting to the end, and we are almost there. This is our last recording of the week. I've enjoyed seeing everybody and have enjoyed these discussions. Excited to dig into this with you. So I think the first thing I want to hit before we kind of get to the how do they get over the top question, talk about some offseason housekeeping for this team. If you're just thinking about the things that needed to get checked off the to-do list for the Lions here in the short term, we're recording this on February 27th. It'll likely run, I don't know, sometime next week. So before free agency gets rolling, what are the smaller things this team needs to get taken care of?
Yeah, right now I think it's familiarity and catching up with kind of the new coaches. They hired basically a brand new coaching staff. A lot of their guys departed. 2 new coordinators, John Morton at OC, Kelvin Shepard DC. So, they're familiar with some of those guys. Morton was here in 2022. Shep's been around since the start of this thing. So really just, getting to know the entire room instead of just their position groups or whatnot. So that's been, ongoing. I would say, having conversations with their free agents. Kevin Zeitler was a big part of what they did this past season. Carlton Davis, cornerback, he's a free agent, and I'm guessing he's going to command, some attention from outside teams. And, just kind of pushing forward, injury stuff. Aiden Hutchinson is working his way back. Saw a video of him running and sprinting kind of for the first time since he got hurt. So, just really, the Lions weren't far off last year. It was weird that, injuries kind of hit them hard, but I think it's just kind of retooling after some of the changes that we saw this offseason.
On the coordinator side of it, I think it kind of is as simple as, can these guys do what the other guys did, right?
Yeah.
Like that's the most important thing. Can we just maintain this level? So I don't think there's really a ton to talk about there, right? There's no ambiguity about what's necessary and how you do it. If Johnny Martin does 85% as good of a job as Ben Johnson did, if Kelvin Shepard does 80% of as good of a job as Aaron Glenn did, that's kind of what you're hoping for here.
Yeah.
The personnel side is where maybe we can get a little bit more creative. First thing I'll start with is Carlton Davis. The way that I would see it from afar, you can correct me if I'm wrong, they drafted Ennis Rankstraw in the second round last year.
Mm-hmm.
You have somebody in the pipeline. Is that the thought here, that hopefully we can replace this with a cheaper in-house option, given some of the expenses we have elsewhere right now?
Yeah, I think so. Brad always views the long term, and he makes decisions like that a year ahead of time. So he was able to get Terrion Arnold, a starter outside last year in the first round, and then Ennis Rankstraw. He's kind of flown under the radar in terms of this cornerback discussion, but we talked to him at locker room cleanout day, and one thing he said was, look, the Lions were getting ready to start me in week 2 against the Buccaneers, but I think he hurt his hamstring right before kickoff. They had to make him inactive for that one and landed on IR a couple times later. So really that kind of set him back as a rookie, but they liked him a lot. He was a dog in training camp. He was exactly what they wanted. I think they liked him more on the inside, but I think he can play outside too if they want to put him out there. So, if they don't bring back Carlton, I think they would probably imagine, Ennis is ready for that spot. But I could also see them going after a stopgap, like if Darius Slay is out there, the Eagles move on from him. He loves Detroit, always loved playing there. So if you can bring him back on a 1-year deal and maybe give Ennis more time to develop behind the scenes, I think that would be a good idea too. So
I think Brad's done a really good job over the last couple of years. And sometimes it's worked out, sometimes it hasn't.
Mm-hmm.
But they've been very intentional about making sure they have bites at the apple in the secondary. Do we have enough bodies here where whatever the permutation ends up being, we can figure out a group of 5 or 6 that we feel good about? So I would not be surprised to see them add to that group, even if there is sort of an in-house replacement for Davis baked in.
Sure. They're all about competition and depth. Obviously the depth was tested a ton this year. So I imagine if you're a front office, you see a year like that where guys are dropping like flies, it's going to change your approach a little bit more. And maybe you're a little bit more in tune with that depth and just having as many bodies as possible to prevent something like that happening again.
So they're in a unique situation here. They have $52 million in 2025 cap space, but then they have $28 million in 2026 cap space because those contracts have started to kick in, right? Jared Goff has a $70 million cap hit in 2026. How they navigate that will be interesting. We'll say that, right? Do they restructure that? Is that something they're willing to do? How aggressive do they get in some of these levers that they're pulling? These are the questions that you have to start asking yourself when you have this sort of team. When you have a team full of expensive pieces because you've drafted so well. Even in that year, Amon-Ra St. Brown is a $33 million cap hit that year. Penei Sewell is a $28 million cap hit in 2026. This is what happens when you start giving out these contracts. So I'm curious, even though they have a pool of money now, because some of that stuff is looming, what level of aggressiveness do you expect from them on the open market given where they are right now?
Yeah, obviously the contracts add a different element to that discussion, but, Brad has always been, I'm going to operate in maybe the tier 2, tier 3, tier 4 bucket instead of the top tier guys. And, he kind of was a little feisty with us the other day where he's like, a lot of people are like, oh, you're not getting the $15, $20 million guy in the open market. He's like, we've been giving out contracts $8 million, $10 million, $12 million. That's not chump change. We're still getting quality players like a David Montgomery, like a DJ Reader, trading for Carlton Davis, signing a Meek Robertson. So that's kind of the bucket that he's kind of operated in over the last few years. And I would expect that to continue. One thing is he told us is, he doesn't like giving out big money deals to guys that he doesn't really know what they're all about.
When you're protective of your culture, that is one way that you have to operate. And if there is one organization in the NFL recently that has been protective of their culture, I think it would be the Detroit Lions.
Yeah, that's one way to put it for sure. Yeah. And like to a point, it's like, you got to retain your own talent. And if you're drafting that well, you're going to have to pay these guys. And they're very cognizant of that. They're very aware. They've always been very aware. And even after handing out deals to Jared Goff and, Amon-Ra St. Brown and Penei Sewell and even Lee McNeil, Taylor Decker, like those are guys they wanted around. They kind of factored that in years ago. And, they know the cap's going up. So let's get these deals done now. And hopefully we'll have some more space to operate down the road there. But they're all about protecting their own, keeping their guys in house, keeping this core together as long as possible. And, building around and supplementing that group.
Obviously, the Zeitler question and the Carlton Davis question, those are two of the bigger free agents. Other than that, the figuring out those roles, is this just as simple as if we get healthy, we feel like we're going to be okay? Or are there areas of more urgent need on the roster, in your opinion, where no matter what we're getting back from our in-house guys, we need to add here either way?
I think they would still need to add, even if they were healthy and maybe made it to the Super Bowl, and who knows if they would have won or not. But like, they still have long-term needs. Like, they don't really have a long-term answer opposite Aiden Hutchinson. That's something that maybe they've been looking for, but haven't been able to find in past drafts. And like, Brad's not one to reach. If he has the 6th pick, he's not going to take. A couple years ago, he was going to take a defensive end that he didn't like. I'll trade down and get Jahmyr Gibbs. So he's always going to operate like that, stick to his board, not reach for a position of need perceived. So, we'll see what happens with this upcoming draft. You can find an edge, maybe a defensive tackle. Lee McNeil's coming off a torn ACL. So you got some injuries there. DJ Reader's getting up there in age and has 1 year left on his deal. So maybe it's like, replenishing the group that has helped you get this far. But maybe some guys you can afford to let walk in the future if they're getting up there in age, you try to replace those guys. Think about that now.
Do we expect Zadarius Smith to be back?
That's the big question because he's got some pretty significant void years on his contract. It's like maybe you try to restructure that and bring him back, but if not, you could probably just clean sweep and cut ties this year. I know he wants to be back. He's been talking about it a little bit this offseason, but it's hard to see him back on his current contract. It's a little bit difficult for me to envision.
When I'm looking at that group specifically, and I've kind of thought this for a while, and there was a moment where it seemed like James Houston might be this guy, but they have so many like big-bodied pocket pusher types, right? Yeah. That's what Pascal is. That's what Onwuzurike was before he's hitting free agency. Yeah. McNeil was a dynamic presence, and Hutchinson is obviously, but other than that, it's a lot of big-bodied guys who are great rotational pieces, but you're not going to scare anybody with them. Yeah. So it feels like that's the skill set they need. Can we get somebody that maybe is a little bit more explosive, a little bit bendy to be that complementary piece other than Aiden? Do you think that's a fair representation?
I do. They definitely need some more speed. They need a guy that can win quickly because that's been their bread and butter, the pocket pushers, pocket crushers. Marcus Davenport was kind of the blueprint under Aaron Glenn here, but got a new DC and a new D-line coach in Casey Rogers. And when he was in Tampa, he's working with some smaller guys that are faster and explosive. So it's like maybe he tries to find more of those guys. But I do think you look at that room right now, James Houston is gone. They don't really have that quick speed rusher or quick win guy outside of, an Aiden Hutchinson that can do that anytime he lines up. So I think just adding another guy like that whether it's in a rotational role or maybe someone that you feel is good enough to hold up against the run long term. Up to Aiden Hutchinson, that's something that I would kind of look for if I'm the Lions.
Anything on offense where other than just like staying the course? Is there something that we need to add to this formula to take us from point A to point B?
Yeah, again, I think it's just more future needs, if you want to say that. Like, I'm kind of looking at wide receiver. One thing they were desperately looking for all training camp was a big-bodied X receiver. Did not have that in their regular competition with guys they had, but they went out and got Tim Patrick, who's very serviceable for them. He's a free agent too, so I would imagine they try to bring him back, but if not, maybe you can get that in the draft at some point. And then Jameson Williams, he's going to be due for an extension down the road. And it's like, do you want to pay him, $20 million, whatever it takes to bring him back when you're already giving out so many other deals here? If they view him as part of the core, I think that you can realistically make that happen. But if not, maybe start looking at other receivers now.
I didn't really think about the coaching staff changes maybe leading to personnel changes. I'm probably underrating that. What shifts do you think we might see? Because in my mind, it's just like, let's just stay the course. Let's just stay the course. Yep. Am I oversimplifying that? Or do you think we will see some tweaks that could lead to them seeking out some different sort of archetypes, body types, that kind of stuff?
I think it depends, So the guy I'm looking at is Casey Rogers, new D-line coach. He's a guy that was in Dallas when Dan Campbell was a player. I think they crossed paths in Miami. So he called him, one of the best defensive line coaches in the NFL. And obviously you lose a guy like Terrell Williams, who he said the same thing about him. Being able to replace him with a coach like Casey Rogers is a big win. And I think Dan will let Casey kind of decide what he wants to do. Obviously Kelvin Shepard will run the entire defense, but he's going to lean on Casey and say, hey, what do you look for? I imagine Brad will have this conversation with him. So, a guy like Kalijah Kancey, he was a smaller DT that has some pass rush juice. So, if he's okay with types like that, whereas Aaron Glenn maybe preferred the bigger bodies, I could see that being an avenue that they try to explore a little bit more of.
Anything else on your mind in terms of like, okay, this is what needs to happen? Like, these are the boxes we need to check other than just getting healthy if we're going to take this where we want to go.
Yeah, it does start with health because if they were healthy, they really could have made a run.
That's why this is difficult, right? And so, like, when you're talking about a team and the other teams we've done as part of this exercise, the Ravens, the Bills, the Packers, there are tangible things where it's like, we need this skill set. We need to go out and get this type of player. These are the things we don't have. With the Lions, you could absolutely tell yourself a story of, if we just bring back everybody and everybody's healthy and we can replace these kind of veteran skill sets that we've lost with stopgaps, which they've shown a consistent ability to do. Yep. So they deserve so much benefit of the doubt with that. It's like, who's your next Carlton Davis? Who's your next Kevin Zeitler? I have faith in their ability to figure that out. You combine that with everybody coming back, you could talk yourself into the idea that they're right there. Yeah. But that also, that you can run into problems that way. Yeah. Because it's like, oh, as long as we're healthy, we'll be fine. And then you don't have the urgency you probably need to go out and get those 1, 2, or 3 pieces that are going to take you over the top. So how you balance that as a team builder, that's why Brad Holmes makes a lot more money than me.
Exactly. I mean, it's a really interesting conversation because they won 15 games with 17 guys on IR. So it's like, I'm trying to nitpick, and it's like, well, maybe if that guy were healthy, it makes a difference. So that's the big question right now. It's like, I imagine if you ask Dan Campbell, he'll say we got everything we need. But again, that can be a difficult game. You want to become stagnant. You don't want to. You want to always keep improving and advancing your roster if you can. So, they got some extra capital. They got a comp pick from AG going to the Jets this year and another one next year. So maybe they can play around and see what they can get out of those picks. They traded a third for Carlton last year, and he was such a big addition to their secondary. So if you can make a move like that and just kind of, I guess, ensure. It's tough to say ensure because you never know what happens with injuries, but ensure that your depth is better than it was last year. I think that's all you're hoping for with a team that had a stacked roster like the Lions did last year.
At that Zeitler spot, do you feel like Christian Mahogany is a reasonable option there?
Yeah, they love him. Okay. He was awesome in the spot starts that he, a few times that he started. He was a guy that I think they probably had a higher grade on him than where he actually went.
I think there are people who really liked him in the draft. I remember Nate really was a big fan of his, and to see him fall to the 6th round.
That was surprising.
There are so many instances like that where like, oh, I can't believe that guy fell, and there's a reason, and that it ends up not mattering. But he's one of those guys that I know that he had some fans in the draft community, and so the fact that he fell that far, I think he's not necessarily a 6th round talent. I guess that's what we could say.
I think you'd start in this league for 10 years and you'd be perfectly fine with it. But yeah, I think Graham Glasgow's a bigger question. He's getting up there in age, did not have a great season. So maybe, I don't know, if Zeitler departs, you can move Graham back to right guard and stick him between a couple of all-pros. Maybe that helps him out a little bit more. But if not, I think they could probably add another guard, whether it's in the draft or, a starter to compete.
The last thing I'll ask you here on offense, when you have Johnny Morton coming in, obviously Hank Fraley comes back.
Do you feel like we'll see any sort of shift in what they want to be based on the new voices there? Or again, is this more like, let's just maintain the status quo because we felt like we were moving along at a pretty good clip?
We talked to Morton a couple days ago, and he seems to kind of want to stick to the status quo. He was here in 2022 when they kind of built this offense, and was just an extra voice in the room, a veteran guy that's seen everything. He's coached for some of the best coaches in the league, in Sean Payton, John Gruden, Jim Harbaugh. So it's like he's seen everything in this league. So he was able to lend an ear to Ben Johnson when he needed it. Passing concepts, he was pretty big in installing some of those in 2022. So I imagine he wants to keep things mostly status quo. He'll put his own touch on things, but he's ready to keep this thing rolling. Any
insight into why they went outside of the building rather than elevating somebody like Tanner Engstrand or some of the guys they already had on the staff?
Yeah, it was funny. After they hired Morton, I kind of went back, did a control F, and was looking through transcripts, trying to see like Campbell talking about John Morton. And you see, October 2023, John Morton was big for us, man. He, there's a lot of stuff that we do now that we kept from what he did back then, talking to Campbell's Southern draw. It's probably a bad one. But, you kind of see it. And he's been talking about him for years since he left. And I think just knowing their relationship goes back to their time with Sean Payton in New Orleans. That was a guy that he trusts. There's a clip from Hard Knocks from the 2022 season when the Lions were on. We're talking about Craig Reynolds, and Campbell's at the whiteboard saying, like, would we really miss Craig Reynolds if we don't bring him back? Like, what do you think? And he's asking his coaches. And a lot of them were quiet. John Morton was the first guy to step up and say, he's everything we're all about. We can't lose that guy. And then the rest of the room kind of followed suit. So I think that kind of speaks to how valued he is. Even back then, that was his first year and only year with the team before he came back. So Campbell really trusts him. You can get a veteran on one side on the offense and then the young guy on defense with Kelvin Shepard. I think that was probably part of it too. And, they're ready to keep it rolling.
It's funny that you mentioned that because my exposure to like who Johnny Morton is solely in references like that, where it's just like it's offhanded things. I remember talking to Ben Johnson. It was after that first half season when he was calling plays. It was going into the 22 season, I want to say. And he was talking about, Johnny's background and just like the very deep knowledge he has of passing concepts. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of respect toward him from the coaching community. It's the way that coaches talk about him. It's just like, oh yeah, that guy knows his shit, man. Like that's how people talk about him. So the fact that that's how he's come up in that sphere where every once in a while Dan mentions him in like a reverent tone is just not surprising because that's essentially how I've come to know who he is even.
Exactly. And I was curious to see like, okay, what exactly did he do for you guys in 2022? So I asked Campbell that when he was at the podium. He was like, it was a lot of behind the scenes work. It was, situational football is probably like one of his best attributes. Like he gives us tendencies on what teams do on third down and goal line situations, whatnot. And we took that information, we ran with it, and it helped us win games. So he's a detailed guy. He's a grinder, and I think a lot of coaches respect that. There's a reason why Sean Payton's hired him twice, why Jim Harbaugh's hired him twice, multiple times. So it's like this guy knows his stuff, and coaches respect it for sure.
I think one of the big things here is offsetting somebody like him with a Hank Fraley.
Yeah.
Because if you look back at what that Jets team was that he was the offensive coordinator for, if it were up to him, he'd probably throw it 65 times a game down the field. And so having essentially the way that I see this, and I'm sure they haven't talked about it this way, but it's almost like you have co-OCs with a pass game coordinator and a run game coordinator. That's kind of how it feels to me from the outside.
Yeah, and they're going to run the ball for sure. And you got David Shaw here, and he's another guy. He's their pass game coordinator now, but he's obviously a guy that loves to run the ball. So they got enough guys to kind of gel and mesh together where it's not going to be a 60-time, have Goff let it rip 50 times in a game. They're still going to run the ball, and Hank Fraley keeping him was huge because I know a lot of teams wanted him or were interested in him. So to give him that promotion to run game coordinator so he has a little bit more responsibility and make him happy was huge. That's going to make a difference for them.
I was just looking back at it right now because I was curious. The 2017 Jets threw the ball 511 times with Josh McCown and Bryce Petty.
Yeah.
So again, rooting it a little bit in Hank Fraley's sensibilities, probably the right level of balance for the 2025 Lions.
The back's a little bit better too. I'm not really moved by Bilal Powell and like a 40-year-old Matt Forte from that roster, but yeah, got some more weapons to work with.
What a fascinating team this is. I'm looking at it right now. Robbie Chosen had 114 targets. Jermaine Kearse had 102. Austin Safarian Jenkins checking in with 74 targets for that team in 2017. I feel comfortable saying this. I think the 2025 Lions have better players than John Morton did last time he was an offensive coordinator.
Slightly. That's a hot take, but I agree with you.
Colton Pouncy, always great to see you. Always great to chat with you, sir. Appreciate the time. We will do it again very soon.
Absolutely, man. Thanks for having me on.
All right, guys, that's all we've got. Thank you so much to Colton. Thank you so much to Derrik. Really enjoyed that. That is the end of our free agency preview coverage. We will be coming your way on Monday for a long, long time. 5 hours of live streaming starting at 12 p.m. Eastern, breaking down all the signings as they roll in. One of my favorite NFL days of the year. I've always loved the first day of the tampering period. We've done the live streams every year, but we're really taking it to a different level this year. Got a ton of fun guests. Mina's going to be on with us, David Hellman, Mike Sando, Danny Parkins, Fran Duffrey, Chase Daniel, bunch of friends of the show swinging through to help us just process everything that's coming in real time. So please come join us for that on the Athletics NFL YouTube page. Like I mentioned previously, we're also going to have a podcast in the feed that is separate from that will come out overnight. So if you are a podcast listener, there will still be a reaction to everything that happened. It'll just be a little bit shorter than that 5-hour live stream. And then we're going to have separate live streams coming each afternoon on Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday next week in the same way we've done every single year, because I love doing them, and I think they're fun in this stretch of the calendar. So please be on the lookout for all of that. For now, that's all we've got. Appreciate you guys listening. Enjoy your weekend.